Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. We've also just launched our brand new LinkedIn page. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. My name is Sarah Torian, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to post any questions that may come to you during the conversation using the Q&A box. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording, as well as to all the resources shared during the presentation and in the chat, will be shared in a follow-up email to all who registered. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Lastly, before we begin, I would like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week, we will have an exciting doubleheader, beginning with a Crucible of Practice Salon focused on opportunities to embed learning opportunities in the everyday places that children and families go in the 12:30 p.m. Eastern time slot, followed by a session lifting up strategies for stabilizing the early learning workforce at 3 p.m. Eastern. The following week, we'll have another doubleheader, starting with a funder to funder conversation, exploring the more than money philanthropy role of convening at 12:30, followed by a session exploring the ways in which states and districts can align investments to build durable capacity to promote the early school success of children, with state chiefs and local superintendents from Connecticut and Mississippi sharing their efforts and insights. Registration and more information for these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Becky Miles-Polka, a senior consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone who's joining us today for this webinar on High-Dosage Tutoring, State Strategies for Advancing Equitable Learning Recovery. We know that high-dose tutoring has emerged as a key strategy to help mitigate the learning loss that has been associated with the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, we know that tutoring was an important part of learning strategy for children. But what we know and what we've learned over the past 18 months in our previous webinars is that tutoring as a strategy must be available to the right children in the right dose and at the right time. We've learned about various district models, and just last week we heard about the critical importance of the relationship between the tutor and the student. In today's webinar, we're going to learn more about what it means to scale a tutoring strategy statewide. What have we learned from these early adopters? What are some of the key components that make a successful statewide investment in tutoring? And we will hear from a recent example in North Carolina and the nuts and bolts of starting a new model. And today, I'm really honored that we are joined by our moderator, Barbara O'Brien, who is a senior fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Barbara served as the president of the Colorado Children's Campaign from 1990 to 2006. And if you don't know much about the Children's Campaign, I would encourage you to go look it up and see what they accomplished. And then Barbara served as lieutenant governor of Colorado from 2007 to 2011. And she recently completed 8 years on the Denver School Board, completing her final term in 2021. where she led the development of the early literacy plan and worked to expand funding for social and emotional supports for students. Barbara, welcome, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Becky and Sarah. I'm honored to be moderating this incredible panel. I can't wait to hear what the conversation covers. I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist and remind everyone to please access the detailed bios that are in the chat. So we're going to start with John Paul Smith, who is the Executive Director of North Carolina Education Corps. Allison Rose Sokol, the Education Trust Vice President of P12 Policy, Practice, and Research. And Casey Sullivan Taylor, the Policy Director of Early Literacy for ExcelinEd. So I'm going to ask the panelists to start by just giving us 2 minutes each in that order, John, Allison, and then Casey, about how you ended up in this role as a way to kind of help people imagine career pathways and options. I always find that interesting. So John Paul, how did you end up where you are?
Good afternoon, Barbara. It's an honor to be with you. So I have been obsessed with this question of what world are we living in now and how best do we enable human flourishing for about 15 years. And I've been involved in a number of different nonprofits that work at the intersection of the public and private sector. And part of my time in the nonprofit sector has been focused on how do we create opportunities for more young Americans to do national civilian service through programs like AmeriCorps, Teach for America is an example. And in August, September of 2020, I was talking with Caroline Farmer, who works in the Office of the Governor in North Carolina, and she oversees the Commission on Volunteerism and Community Service. We were talking about how there was legislation coming down from the Senate to triple financing for AmeriCorps, and the need for an organization in North Carolina to, in anticipation of that type of financing, help to actually recruit and to train and to coach and to place young people who want to serve in nonprofits and in the public sector in North Carolina. At the same time, the chair of the State Board of Education in North Carolina was looking to build an organization that would recruit and train and coach high impact literacy tutors to support students. We got in a conversation with him. He needed somebody to step up to build the organization. And that's how I got involved in North Carolina Education Corps. And we've been off to the races since then.
Great, thank you. Allison.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Looking at the participant list, I'm seeing lots of familiar names and people I'm excited to have a conversation with, and some new folks, and excited to make new connections here. I started my career in education as a classroom teacher. I taught 5th and 6th grade in Washington, D.C., and eventually moved on to get my doctorate at UNC Chapel Hill in an effort to understand how our systems can better serve our most underserved students, particularly students of color and students from low-income backgrounds who for too long haven't been given equitable resources and learning opportunities to meet their fullest potential and achieve their dreams. But specifically related to tutoring, I worked as an instructional coach actually for a targeted intensive tutoring program. I supported kindergarten and 1st grade teachers who were learning receiving professional development to provide targeted tutoring to young readers. And so while I bring today the research and policy from the Education Trust, I also bring with me that firsthand experience of seeing how both the academic support and the relationship that these young children had with their teacher was a complete game changer, and really gave them the supports they needed to be able to succeed in their kindergarten and 1st grade classrooms. And they became readers. And seeing that happen really instilled in me a belief, generally in the importance of giving targeted supports to the students most in need, but specifically in the power of targeted intensive tutoring and the world that it can really open up for students who just need a little bit of extra help. So excited to have a conversation with you all today.
Thank you. And Casey.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to be on this esteemed panel. I'm just excited about the conversation and I'm thrilled to be a part of this session today. I started my career as a teacher overseas in Japan immediately after college, teaching English as a second language, and then returned to the States and taught reading, and have always had a passion for literacy. But I also know the power that literacy has and how it can impact lives when children and then as adults, people struggle in reading. And so I have had the opportunity to serve as an interventionist, a literacy coach, and to work with the Mississippi Department of Education in their literacy initiative from 2013 to 2019, and then moved to North Carolina, where I worked with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and recently moved to join ExcelinEd as their early literacy policy director, and join the work that Dr. Kimiana Burke is already moving forward and advancing. And so I'm thrilled to be here today, and thrilled about this topic and the power that it has to help fill the instructional gaps that some students have, even previous to the pandemic, but certainly since.
Thank you. So Casey, stay on, because I'm going to start with you on this section. If you could talk about your work and the results of the research you've been doing and working on, and your blog on your new report. So 5 to 7 minutes on what you've been doing.
Certainly. Thank you, Barbara. So in my role at ExcelinEd, we support states in their efforts to adopt and implement comprehensive early literacy policy. And as I was thinking towards the wrap up of the school year, advancing into summer programming, and even planning for next year, as we seek to regain the opportunity for students to fill those gaps that may have come through the time of the pandemic, we know that there are so many students who need the opportunity for more instructional time. And high-dosage tutoring is a research supported approach to filling those gaps, to regaining instructional time that may have been lost. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to develop a blog around that topic. And as I was researching, I looked at various states, and I think in the time that the research showed that there were around 36 states who actually have some model around tutoring. But I really wanted to focus on some who had variations in their models, because it's not a one size fits all approach. States have the opportunity to find what works for them. But I really believe that without state involvement, without LEA district involvement, we may not be able to reach all the students who need the opportunity for tutoring and for that supplemental instruction. And so a state model is really a wonderful way to look at a high impact investment that can have a high level return on the time that students get to spend with that tutor and benefiting from the instructional piece. So one of the first states that I looked at, because I was intimately familiar with their program, was North Carolina. And so the component with North Carolina, they developed North Carolina's Education Core, which John Paul has already talked a little bit about their development, and he'll talk more about it. But they developed a model that was based on a state board of education and the governor's office partnering together to use funds to establish the North Carolina Education Core. And then they've done something unique in that they've transitioned to become a 501c3 nonprofit. And that's an interesting model that supports the opportunity for sustainability long term. Their tutors focus on K-3 foundational skill support. And then they also make a point of training their teachers or their tutors in science of reading and evidence-based literacy practices so that they can ensure that they are going to get the biggest impact from the time that those tutors spend with students, and that their practices are based on evidence and research. And then it's going well, and the governor has recently committed additional federal funding so that they can recruit, train, and place more tutors throughout the state. So they're scaling that model up. And then I also was interested in the model that Tennessee developed with their all-core tutoring group. It was again established by state leaders. They used COVID-19 funding. They used a grant match approach, which they can support tutoring in combination with the school year or with summer programming. And they used resources as a part of this to also, in addition to the recruiting, equipping, and training tutors, they developed some resources. One example is their early literacy guide, which has very explicit instructional routines to equip the tutors so that they are delivering those evidence-based practices. And then they again have committed additional funds to expand their high-dosage tutoring program. And then the final example that I cited in the blog was the District of Columbia. Again, a different model, but the opportunity for them to make a strong impact. So they have developed an implementation guide around high dosage tutoring, and it's for local education agency leaders. And they gave guidance on how to develop and build an effective program at the district or the LEA level. They established HIT grants, high impact tutoring grants that districts can apply for. And then they also targeted as their focus the group of at-risk students, and then any student who experienced disrupted instruction during the pandemic can also qualify. A portion of their funding is earmarked for program evaluation services, and that even includes a multi-year evaluation of their effectiveness. And that's such an important aspect to ensure that we're looking at the impact that these tutoring opportunities have and the return on the investment. And then finally, with the blog, I made some I put forward some considerations for states who may be considering and building a model. And so a few of the things that I found through my research that make a big difference, and even in other program implementation opportunities that I've worked with in the past, things that I've found to be very important and effective. But with tutoring, we want to be sure with high dosage tutoring that we're ensuring they get that high dosage component, which means we have to allocate sufficient time. And time during the school day is super powerful because that ensures that some of our students who may not have access to it outside of the school day are eligible to be recipients of tutoring. And then ensuring that we look at the frequency. So whether it's 3 to 5 times a week, a minimum of 30 minutes, even in some cases, models are built with up to 90 minutes. And then providing training and development. I've talked a little bit about what a couple of states have done to equip their tutors, but that is an essential piece that we want to be sure the tutors are equipped with evidence-based practices, that they also know how to look at data and to make intentional decisions around the instructional piece that students need to fill the gaps and to truly accelerate learning. Then focusing on continuous improvement and feedback. That's an essential part of a model being successful, and celebrating achievements and success. And John Paul is a great example of that with NC Ed Corps. They are one, if you go to their website, you'll be able to see a lot of things where they have interviewed all different roles and people who have been involved in their programming and looked at the impact that it's had on their own lives, as well as the impact that they're having on students. And so that celebration and the opportunity to share in success is a critical model. And I will pass it back to you, Barbara, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk through some of the elements of the blog, and look forward to hearing from colleagues on the panel.
Thank you, Casey. John Paul, we're going to dig deeper into North Carolina because Casey set us up so well to understand the context of what you're trying to accomplish. So take it away.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and we've really benefited from Casey's guidance along the way too. We work closely with the Department of Public Instruction in the state of North Carolina, which has been fabulous in helping to inform our growth. So the first thing, as everyone I think here probably knows, is that ideas are really easy and execution is hard. So we wanted to make sure that we're really thoughtful in how we approach ramping up high dosage tutoring. So we've been thinking about our ramp up in the state of North Carolina in 3 phases. The first phase is just the startup phase. Second phase is sure up. Third phase is scale up. And I'll go a little bit deeper into each of these phases in a minute. This coming year, just as a progress report, we will be working with 30 public school unit partners. That's a couple charter schools and a lot of traditional public school districts. And the way that we're thinking about working with this group of 30 partners is we wanted to get a sense of what does it take to support different types of students under different conditions. So we support both with students in both urban and rural districts. It was really important for us to have a statewide mix of districts that we begin to work with. And then as we learn what it takes to support the sample set, we can then scale up from there. So all of our tutors right now are in person. We are thinking about expanding into virtual tutoring and engaging volunteers, mainly so that we can reach more students faster in the state of North Carolina. As we think about our high-level metrics, we are thinking about how many students are we reaching. So there's a quantity measure there. How much student growth are we seeing as a result of the type of support that they're getting from high-impact tutors? And then we also believe strongly that there needs to be an emphasis on building consistent relationships, not only with the students, between the tutors and the students, but also between any statewide organization, whether it's a governmental organization or non-governmental organization, with the districts that they're working with. So that's kind of a quick overview of our growth trajectory. As I said, startup, sure up, scale up. Phase 1, we just got through phase 1. We're entering into phase 2. We're going from just getting started, adapting and persisting to moving really fast, doing good work well in a disciplined way and really sticking the landing. And as we really learn what does it take to support different types of districts in the state of North Carolina, at that point, we'll look to scale up dramatically. So we're looking at Tennessee as a reference point for what can be possible when you're really focusing on the number of students who need support, but we're taking a little bit more of a measured approach to be able to get there. We'll go to the next slide. So here's just a little bit of our organizational progress, and I've put more detail into these slides than I'll speak to during the webinar, but I want the slides to be a resource to folks because the devil is in the details oftentimes. I want to make sure people have all of this information available to them as they're looking to scale up their practices. So as Casey and others have mentioned, we started in September 2020. We initially started as an organization or a really initiative of the State Board of Education, the governor's office. We spun out into an independent 501c3 nonprofit so that we could be a little bit more nimble and that we could really focus on not only responding to student need in the midst of COVID, but so that we could support students in the long run. We thought it'd be a better setup for us. So we're going from just getting started to really perfecting our business model, building infrastructure, and also building awareness and relationships and results to be able to scale. Next slide. Happy to speak to the different types of core members that we have, where we recruit folks, how many tutors we've had so far. We can get into that in Q&A if folks would like. This is also as a reference point when people want to look back at it. Next slide. Where did we get our original money? We pulled together what I would call some family and friends money. So we did get some initial money from the governor's office to start up. We then got some more private funding. And this is one of the reasons that we wanted to create a 501c3 is to have both public and private money and make it really easy to raise both. So we got some angel money from some private foundations. We've just secured $13.5 million from the North Carolina General Assembly. And we got an additional $725,000 or so from the governor's office. And we're looking to do a little bit more of a private fundraise as we shore things up. Next slide. We've put training in place. We really want to focus on high quality tutors. Our tutors do about 60 hours of training with us. And then they also do some what I would call last mile training with the school districts. Can speak to that. Next slide. And like any organization, we face challenges, we face growth risks, and there's also tremendous opportunity. So some of the challenges that we faced have been systemic. As we all know, we're facing a labor market that's had shortages, especially within the education space. We've been operating in the middle of the pandemic. We're learning how best to work with districts. And then there are also just some firm-specific challenges that we've been dealing with. We're brand new, so we're still building brand awareness. That's really important as you try to recruit tutors. We're bootstrapping at the beginning, and we're really focused on how do we increase the quantity and the quality of tutors at the same time pretty rapidly. Next slide. So we started with this past year, we had 243 tutors total. We were aiming for 250. We're trying to get to 1,000 tutors over the next couple of years. And as I said, these tutors will be working with the kind of sample set of districts to really help us understand what does it take to support students in different types of districts across the state. Beyond that, we'll look to scale up to really meet student need. Next slide. We follow the high impact tutoring model. We really lean into the research of the National Student Support Accelerator. A lot of the tips that Casey has elevated for everybody. All of our tutors are focused on working with students 1-to-1 or up to 1-to-3. They work with students 3 times a week with 30 minutes per session or more. They use standards aligned curriculum to work with the students. And then they also monitor student progress and skills on a regular basis. And they benefit from coaching and oversight, both from our team and for the school districts that they're working with. These are slides that are probably best for folks to reference after the webinar, but they're more detail into what implementation actually looks like and how our partnership works between our organization, districts, and schools. Next slide. And here's where our partners will be this coming year. As you can see, we have made we've been very intentional in terms of working with districts across the state, and the different colors here are different county tiers. So it's been really important for us to work with some of the wealthier counties down to the less socioeconomically advantaged counties. So those are what the colors are about. We can stop here.
Thank you for that. We're going to move to Allison now, who's going to take us back to looking at state models and research across the country. So Allison.
Thanks. So we're going to get a chance to dig into the research and policy recommendations in just a few minutes when we get to have a conversation, but I just want to take a step back and give you a sense of where education trust is coming from in this conversation. So in March or April of 2020, when school buildings shut down, it became apparent very, very quickly to us, although we had no idea how long the pandemic would last and the significance of the impact that it would have on all of us, including our most underserved students and families, but we knew it was going to impact students, and we immediately asked ourselves, what are districts and schools going to need, and what are they going to need to know in order to address the unfinished learning that we worried many students would have, and to address the disparities that we feared would be exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we partnered with a research firm called MDRC to take a look at what the last 10 years or so of research say about strategies to address unfinished learning, which is the phrase that the Education Trust uses, often gets talked about as learning loss, although we believe the phrase unfinished learning shifts the conversation to focus on what students can do if given the right supports. And so one of the most impactful strategies for addressing unfinished learning that certainly existed before the pandemic and has only been exacerbated is targeted intensive tutoring. And so we put together a brief, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes when we get into the research, which highlights what the features are in a tutoring program that is most effective, because not all tutoring programs are created equal, which you've already heard from my co-panelists who are highlighting a lot of the evidence-based practices that are most important important for tutoring programs to really have an impact for kids. And once we had that research as our base, we've now used it in our federal, state, and local advocacy. So we were able to use it in our advocacy for the American Rescue Plan, which is giving an unprecedented investment to states and districts to address students' academic, social, and emotional needs. And now are looking to lift up the bright spots we see in states and soon in districts. So we partnered with Future Ed and Education Reform Now. I think some of those folks are actually on this webinar to lift up 5 states that initially, at least, we see some promising things from. So Texas, Tennessee, Colorado, Louisiana, and New Mexico. And I'll get into the details in a little bit about what those programs look like, but it is those states and clearly what you're hearing about North Carolina are really powerful examples of the role that the state can play in providing guidance, resources, and equity guardrails to help district and state leaders use this opportunity, this unprecedented resources to put in place tutoring programs that will help accelerate students' learning, particularly for students who are most in need of those additional supports. And so really excited to lift up those examples and to talk with Casey and John Paul about where we're going next.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move on to some questions now, and we're going to stay with the informal conversational tone of this. So Allison, Casey, and John Paul, if you want to ask each other questions or weigh in, don't feel you have to stay in your own lane. So we're going to start with a question for John Paul and Allison, and it has to do with how you recruit quality tutors, what's involved in that, and what have you learned about recruiting and training tutors for programs that will have measurable impact. So Allison, do you want to start off?
Sure, Barbara, I'm happy to. So, you know, I am not directly recruiting tutors, but I have seen some really promising examples of the ways that states in particular can support tutor recruitment. I think it's important to acknowledge that the context that districts and schools are in, which is staffing shortages, are a very real issue for a lot of our educators and our education leaders. And so thinking about the ways that the state can support districts and schools in bringing in adults, providing them with support and training in order to make tutoring a reality, despite the very real challenges of shortages. So some of those examples include Texas. So Texas has created a vetted teacher corps in an effort to help connect district leaders with high quality tutors. They've provided essentially a vetted list based on a variety of criteria that are evidence-based to try to connect districts with various providers of tutoring because you know, district leaders may want to make tutoring happen, but may have a question about who to partner with. And the state has a really powerful role to play in helping bridge that gap. Another example is New Mexico, which has committed to doing something very interesting, to partner with local schools of education to train college students to serve as tutors. And they've also committed to investing $40 million in what they're calling an Educator Fellows Program to train about 500 paraprofessionals who will help educators deliver various interventions, including tutoring, which is an example of a way that the state can support building the capacity of districts and schools who may be struggling to find enough tutors. And I think the third powerful example, which actually we've already heard about, is the Tennessee All-Core program, which is really a really powerful and promising example of a state's role in making tutoring a reality for students. And so in Tennessee, there's a grant match program, and Tennessee has also done something I think is helpful, which is to give districts the flexibility to figure out which tutors make the most sense in their context, but also putting in place some quality and equity guardrails to ensure that all tutors receive training and that tutoring is happening using evidence-based strategies such as one-on-one or small group tutoring. I'm sure there are other examples, but those three come to mind as really strong examples of the role that the state can play in helping make sure that we have enough really caring, qualified adults who can help provide that additional instructional support that many of our students, particularly students who've been underserved in the past, need. And I'll turn it on to John Paul, who can talk about it more firsthand and some of the challenges he's facing.
Thank you, Allison. So one of the slides has some information on how we approach recruiting. We have three main profiles, and there's a question, I think, in the chat box for the Q&A about whether our tutors are paid or are they volunteers. All of our tutors currently are paid, and they're working part-time with the school district. So we have an interesting model where our team reduces the burden on the school districts that we're working with by doing a lot of the heavy lifting around recruitment for the tutors. We call them our core members. And so what we end up doing is we do a lot of the boots on the ground recruiting, we have a whole recruitment team that goes to job fairs and gets out in the communities that we're working in and, develops word of mouth and that kind of thing. We also work a lot with wholesale marketing. So we do social media marketing. We are looking into radio. We do those types of traditional recruitment campaigns. But we have three main profiles of tutors. One is community college and university students. The second one is stay-at-home caregivers, a lot of stay-at-home parents. And then the third is retirees. And so as we think about recruiting, our main job is to not only recruit folks, but then also, Allison was speaking about quality assurance, train the folks so that they are basically at a level, at the same level of paraprofessionals. So they spend a significant amount of time once we recruited them training both before they start working with students and then in an ongoing way, and they receive coaching while they're serving as tutors to help us with the quality assurance too. I will say, I think there's a lot of opportunity with college students in the state of North Carolina and the UNC system alone. There are over 3,000 young people who are in educator prep programs, a lot of potential there. The challenge with college students is that their schedules change halfway through the year. And so if you're trying to match the schedules of the schools and of the college students, you just have to be super mindful of that. We do think that there's a lot of opportunity to work that kink out, and there's some opportunities for college students to what we call earn, learn, and serve at the same time. So potentially some opportunities for college students to earn academic credit, earn some money, get some work experience in a public school district, and serve their local community members by serving as a tutor. We're working that out. The majority of our tutors right now are stay-at-home caregivers or retirees. So lots of parents who, maybe they're otherwise involved in the PTA or something like that. This is another opportunity for them to make a direct impact on their on students in the schools that they wish to support. And then retirees are phenomenal too. And retired teachers in particular are phenomenal candidates for serving as high impact tutors as well. I will say, I just do want to emphasize with any funders out there, recruitment is hard. Finding people is hard. We have been turning over every stone and we're seeing a lot of progress, But as you think about making investments in high dosage tutoring, don't forget to make investments in time and resources to go just directly into marketing and recruitment. Because tutors don't just show up at the door, you actually have to do a lot of work to get them.
John Paul, do you handle background checks for all your recruits, or do you outsource that?
Yeah, that's a great, light just went out in our office. That's a really good question. So we do handle a lot of the heavy lifting around the initial screening for the candidates. So what we do is we, on our website, all of the tutor candidates have to apply through an application process. They go through that process. There's a written part to that process. There's a video to that process. We screen all the candidates. We do calls with them. We look at their videos. And then we make recommendations to the local school districts, because we have an interesting model where at the end of the day, all of the tutors that we're recruiting and helping to train and helping to coach and support, they end up becoming employees of the local school districts. So we recommend candidates at the point where the districts then need to run background checks. And we're in conversation with districts about, is that something that we could do for you? What would that look like? How do we reduce your burden there? And then what the districts end up doing is, after they do the background check, they'll do the final interview. And then the tutors will be hired directly by the districts.
Thank you. Any other comments on this question? Okay, I'm going to move on to question number two. What evidence do you have of your effectiveness? And I think, Allison, you would have different measures for, the kind of work you do, and John Paul, you're going to need more boots on the ground. But can you talk to us about statewide decisions about implementation and how you measure effectiveness when the train is just leaving the station?
I'm happy to jump in first. I have actually a visual, if you wouldn't mind, whoever's controlling the screen share, which I think might be helpful for our conversation about effectiveness. So I mentioned that we partnered with MDRC to help understand, both what broadly the strategies are that are most effective for addressing unfinished learning, but also what makes those strategies effective. And so this is a chart we put together in a resource that I'm happy to share after we get into a lot more detail. But we created this visual to help conceptualize what the features are of an effective tutoring program, but also to acknowledge that even the most effective tutoring programs don't meet every single one of the things on the left here. That a lot of this is about trade-offs. We have limited resources. And so I think it's helpful to think about where in one area a feature may be less effective, where we need to make up for it in another area. So just to summarize, some of these things have already come up. The most effective tutoring programs, first of all, the ratio is really important. 1-to-1, or certainly a group of fewer than 4 or fewer students, is really key. This allows the tutor to give both the academic support that students need, but also for students to build a relationship with the tutor. We know that a skill building curriculum is really important to the effectiveness of a tutoring program. The research shows that certified teachers are the most effective tutors. I think this is fairly common sense, but that doesn't mean that they're the only effective tutors. Research shows that paraprofessionals are actually nearly as effective as educators, and where paraprofessionals and fully certified teachers aren't an option, trained volunteers or other folks can be brought in, and it just means that the training and supervision need to be really strong, which we've heard folks talk about already. So pre-service and ongoing training and supervision are going to be important in really any case, but particularly for tutors who have less experience in the classroom. Research shows that during the school day is most effective, especially when it complements the regular class. But that doesn't mean that after school or out of school tutoring can't be effective. The program would just need to address some of the challenges such as attendance, which can be a challenge for after school programs, particularly for older students. And then I think finally, the most important thing to acknowledge is that, we use the phrase intensive purposefully because tutoring is most effective when students are receiving it on a very regular basis for an extended period of time. And that sort of daily or regular interaction with a tutor and that ongoing support is really key to building students' skills. And so when we talk with folks about state, district, or school level tutoring practices, we use this to think about sort of what the trade-offs are, but to try to push folks to think about how to structure a tutoring program so that it meets as many of the things in that green, dark green, more effective column, because that is what we need in order to have the greatest impact for students. And in order for particularly advocates, parents, and community members to ask questions when they hear about a tutoring program bubbling up in their district or state, they can say, well, I hear the word tutoring, but who are the tutors? What is the ratio? What is the evidence base? Are important questions to ask in order to get at whether that tutoring program is really going to help accelerate students' learning, give them the skills they need, help them strengthen relationships with their educators, and really help them catch up. And I think a lot of these features are things that the other panelists will talk about both in their firsthand experience and in their research.
There's a question in the Q&A box that I think we'll start with Paul to answer, but then Casey and Allison weigh in. And the question is that a lot of the coaching training done through North Carolina Education Corps. So we've gotten that example, but there's a question about schools and districts that prefer to do training in-house. Is that something that's been weighed? Are you in conflict with districts at all about who's in charge of quality and sort of the cost benefit analysis of different recruiting strategies? John Paul, do you want to jump in that first?
Sure. Yeah. So on the training front, we actually work in collaboration with the school districts on the training. We do the majority of the front end training with the tutors, but what the districts are essential for is, we've chosen to work with our districts. As a startup, you got to figure out where do you want to standardize and where do you want to customize. We have chosen through conversation with our district partners to allow our district partners to use their standards aligned curriculum and to train the tutors up in those standards aligned curriculums to provide the intervention to the students that otherwise maybe the teacher would. So it's been really important for us, for our tutors to be able to speak the same language as the teachers in the classroom so that they can best support students together. And so because we're working in, a couple dozen districts across the state right now, there's a lot of variation in terms of what that intervention curriculum actually is. So what we do is we do a lot of the front end training. The districts do what I call kind of last mile training on here's the intervention curriculum, if they have an intervention curriculum, that the tutors use as they're working with the kids to build particular skills. So there are some districts across the state of North Carolina who have built their own training programs. We actually work with a district, Guilford County Schools, which may have been on this webinar before. Guilford County Schools has a lot of different types of high impact tutors. On early literacy, we work with them. They also have tutors around math. We don't work with them there. They build out training on their own as needed. So we're a little bit flexible when it comes to exactly what type of curriculum the tutors end up using. We defer to the school districts. We want to make sure that their standards align, that they're grounded in the science of reading. But we also think that it's important to allow the districts to make some of their own choices around what's best for the students and how to align what the tutors are doing and what the teachers are doing. part of the reason why we decided to hire our own coaches is because school districts they don't have their own capacity to be able to do that. So the choice to hire our own coaches, it was one out of how do we reduce the burden on the school districts to get going quickly.
Allison or Casey, do you have anything to add to that about measures of effectiveness or working with a school district on quality assurance?
I think
Okay.
that there, sorry. I think that there are a number of ways to look at quality assurance. And John Paul certainly described an excellent way in that they do the training. And I know that part of their training is around the science of reading and evidence-based practices. Tennessee also has an approach where they focus on equipping their early literacy tutors with knowledge around the science of reading, so that, as John Paul said, that they understand and have a shared understanding with the teachers about how early literacy skills are acquired and develop. And so then they have their guide with evidence-based practices as well. So those training modules that they supply, and then the coaching that the tutors get in follow-up and support ongoing as they're in the school districts, I think that that is a tremendous piece for quality assurance and ensuring effectiveness in the delivery of supplemental instruction that can help recover time that they need to. A lot of our students who struggle with reading, they just need more time and repetition. And so if we can give them more time and exposure and the opportunity for more practice, they're very likely to increase their abilities. And so high dosage tutoring with an effective tutor can change that trajectory for students and help them catch up. Another piece around quality assurance is just being sure that our programs are differentiating and that we're not approaching things with a one-size-fits-all, because for students who are placed in a one-size-fits-all model, sometimes it feels like they are locked into something and they may not feel like they're getting the best out of it. But when we work with students to target their specific needs and we communicate that with them and talk with them about where their gaps are, how we're going to set goals and involve them in that goal setting to establish where we're going with tutoring, what our outcomes are going to be, it can make all the difference in their level of investment, engagement, and really their motivation to achieve. So I think that that piece of it has to be a really important part when we think about, if we set a goal for someone, but they don't know what the goal is, it's really hard to meet it. But when we make that a process and a part of our tutoring, so that we're goal setting and we're doing communicated check-ins along the way to talk about the progress and what is our next measure that we're trying to reach, it can make all the difference in outcomes and engagement. And Allison has already talked about the important measure of time and being sure that we're allocating sufficient time. But I think that's one that sometimes tutoring initiatives create a plan, but then it's not protected time, or something happens in the school day and somebody's out, there's not a way to fill in, and then maybe the tutor tries, is shifted to a different role or responsibility. So we really have to be intentional about protecting the time of a tutor and setting those guardrails so that the time is committed to that small group tutoring initiative, and that we're ensuring that students are getting the amount of exposure that they need for improvement.
I just want to lift up what Casey just said about differentiation and targeted supports. I think this is such an important point, so I want to spend a moment on it, which is, I think it really also speaks to the importance of quality data. And we're going to need data for a number of reasons: to be able to identify the students most in need, to be able to identify, as Casey said, like what those students' skill gaps are, because we want to make sure that tutoring accelerates students' learning rather than remediates, which means filling in the gaps and skills that those students have in order for them to be able to be successful in grade level actionable content rather than just repeating the same thing over and over again. And that takes information about which students and also what the students need support in. And then of course, ongoing data to help make sure that tutors can tailor instruction and ultimately know when students ideally are no longer in need of support. This is something I saw firsthand, which is that if we do our jobs well, eventually a student is potentially able to succeed without the additional supports in the classroom, but there may be another child who's in need of support. And so data from beginning to end is really important for making sure that the kids who need it get it and they're getting what they need.
I would love to share some of the tools that we use to measure effectiveness and collect data. And, Allison and Casey are both right. And I think Becky said at the beginning of the webinar, it's really important to get the right children, the right dosage at the right time. And so I'm happy to share that. I think there are a couple of slides that I could speak to on how we measure effectiveness. If it's helpful to the audience, I'd be happy to speak to them.
Can those be pulled up?
That's perfect. Yeah. So there are really three main things that we do to collect information. One is we're doing a formal 3-year mixed methods program evaluation, and we're having independent program evaluators do the research. So one of them is in the middle of this picture right here. It's a woman named Jess Sperling, who's at the Duke Social Science Research Institute. They are conducting this 3-year mixed methods evaluation in partnership with the Friday Institute, which is at NC State University in North Carolina. So what they're doing, if you go to the next slide, they're looking at a whole series of activities that we're delivering on. So they're measuring, how good of a job are we doing at fostering effective partnerships with school districts? How good are we doing at activating untapped talent? So that's really around recruitment. How good are we doing at training and supporting core members or the high-dosage tutors? And how are we ensuring that those tutors are implementing high-impact interventions in the field? So if you skip back to the last slide, the second thing that we're doing with our tutors this coming year, so this year was really we had a homegrown tutor log tracker using Google spreadsheets to track the sessions that the tutors were doing with the students. This coming year, we're really excited to be working with Latera Education, who's built an app, a mobile app, and there's also a web platform where you can go down 2 slides, I think. We will be able to, the app will help us to match tutors and students, and that will actually be done at the school level. So what will happen is the literacy lead or instructional coordinator or a lead teacher within the school will, in the state of North Carolina, we have M-Class, all schools are using M-Class. They will look at M-Class data. They will see where students are and what their needs are. And then where it's appropriate, they'll match our high impact tutors to the students who can benefit from the high impact tutors. So all of our tutors right now are helping students build their phonics and phonological awareness skills. That's where the focus is. So the folks within the school level, they'll use the M-Class data, they'll make the matches using the Latera platform to match the right tutors to the right kids. The second thing that we'll be able to do with this is track individual session information, and our program evaluators will be able to access this on a pretty regular basis. So what it will track is what students are the tutors working with, what skills are the tutors working with the students, so you can barely see them over here on the right, but what skills are they working with, and then how much time are they spending with the students? So, is it really 30 minutes, or is it 40 minutes, or is it 25 minutes? And what days of the week have they worked with them? What students are they working with? All of that. So this tutor log will help us collect feedback regularly from the field, really see what's happening at the school level. And it also has a feature where we can get feedback from the tutors in terms of, how did your session go? Did you have a great session? Do you want to report out on that? Is there additional training that you feel like you need? And we'll be able to get that type of continuous feedback on a regular basis to improve our own processes. So we're really excited about that. And then we're also, we are really honored to work with all of the school districts that we work with who provide ongoing informal anecdotes and information on how the program is doing. So we really have kind of a threefold method for measuring effectiveness and continuous improvement. The first piece being the formal 3-year program evaluation, the second piece being the tutor logs, and then the third piece being just ongoing conversations with our school partners.
Thank you for that. I want to wrap up this section by hearing the 3 panelists talk about the possible financing strategies for long-term sustainability. And anyone who has survived the nonprofit world knows that that takes hard work. So Allison, you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I'll say, you've heard me mention a few times now that the American Rescue Plan is providing an unprecedented investment for states and districts to address unfinished learning, among other things. And so just to level set, the money from the federal government in the form of federal relief in the form of the American Rescue Plan has some requirements in it that actually require states and districts to use a percentage of those funds to address unfinished learning on evidence-based strategies. And tutoring, which we've been talking about, is one of those strategies that has the strongest evidence base behind it. And so states have to use 5% of the money that they're getting from the American Rescue Plan, and districts have to use at least, and I say at least, 20% of the money they're receiving from the American Rescue Plan to address unfinished learning. However, that money, while an amazing start and an incredible opportunity, is just a beginning. And so there are funding streams that can be used to sustain this beyond the few years that we have this federal relief. Number one is Title I. Many folks will say that tutoring is a great example of a kind of strategy that Title I funding could and always has been able to be used on, and that I actually am really hopeful that we'll see states and districts think about how to use Title I and IDEA funding to sustain some of these programs as we see the incredible impact that they'll have. There are other examples of other federal funding streams, such as the Corporation for National and Community Service, tutoring programs like Saga Education, which I think are represented among the participants, and Reading Corps partner with Corporation for National and Community Service to sustain their programs. Title IV Part B of the Every Student Succeeds Act has the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which could be used to support after school programs that could provide tutoring. And ultimately, I'll use this opportunity to say that in many states, we are in need of systemic funding reform so that our districts and schools that serve students of color and students from low-income families have more equitable funding streams to support the kinds of programs like tutoring that are really needed to give those kids the boost that they need. And so while the American Rescue Plan is a great start, there's definitely like long-term sustainability questions that a lot of states and districts will have to grapple with. And before I turn things over to John Paul or Casey, I'll say on the EdTrust's Unfinished Learning website, which I think Becky put in the chat, we have a map that you can go to find out exactly how much money your state is getting in federal relief and how much of that money has to be spent on addressing unfinished learning through evidence-based strategies like tutoring, which I think can be really helpful for conceptualizing the amount of dollars that are available here to put in place the kinds of programs we're talking about.
Thank you for that. Casey, any thoughts on sustainable financing?
Certainly. I think Allison touched on a lot of the federal funding that is available. Also state funds. I know for some of the states they used year funds, the governor's emergency relief funds that they are able to allot based on need. And so that was one of the funds that several states pulled from when they initially started tutoring initiatives during the pandemic. Also grants, even micro grants have been an approach that some states have used. And then even education savings accounts. I actually had a conversation with some state representatives last week that were talking about how they are looking into setting up education savings accounts and how those can be accessed for students to have more equitable access to high dosage tutoring or to other interventions that could make a difference for them.
John Paul?
So Allison and Casey have done a fantastic job of describing specific funding resources and streams. So I think, I'll zoom out and just speak at a little bit of a higher level. When we think about sustainability, and we are talking with, some of the smartest business and policy leaders in the state of North Carolina, the question is not just how sustainable is high impact tutoring, it's, how sustainable is a society where the teachers are burned out, the students are bummed out, and a large percentage of the population can't read. And so the reality is that it's like pay now or pay later. You can pay a fairly high cost to support high impact tutoring now, or you could pay a lot more money down the road because you're not addressing the problem at the root with speed. So, what we think is that it's either pay now or pay later, cheaper to pay now. So we need to invest in it. There are different streams, federal, state, local streams to support this work in an ongoing way. I think Americans are better at responding to the wolf at the door than we are at responding to the termites in the basement. And so what the pandemic has created is this influx of federal dollars to respond to the wolf at the door. And we want to be able to respond both to the wolf and to the termites. A lot of these issues have been around pre-COVID, as everybody here knows. So we're able to use some of the federal relief dollars to just get going and get after it and start to scale up. But it really is going to be critical to evaluate the performance of the different programs, so we have that data to make the case for ongoing support once the federal funds run out. We also know that in terms of sustainability, you could pay teachers $100 million a year and they still wouldn't have time to provide the high impact interventions one-on-one or in small groups to students. So, we need to recognize that teachers basically barely have time to go to the bathroom. We need to engage more high impact tutors to help drive performance of students, which is what they really want to do. So we're also increasing teacher satisfaction and workplace satisfaction by investing in high impact tutoring. And it is going to take braided funding to support this over the long run.
Thank you for that. So we're going to move on to the last section of this webinar and answer as many questions in the Q&A box as we can, and we've already addressed some of them. And I think, Becky, you're going to pull the questions that seem to have the most resonance, right, in the Q&A section and for the panelists.
Sure, Barbara, I'm happy to. There have been more than one question. There has been more than one question about the value of in-school versus out-of-school tutoring models. And I know it has come up a little bit, but do any of you want to speak to that? I know, John Paul, you've talked about how you work very closely with the districts and their specific curricula. But anybody want to take that one? Have anything to say about that?
Happy to jump in at a high level, which is just to say that there are absolutely examples of highly impactful tutoring programs that occur outside the school day, but there are challenges. And so as John Paul's talked about, those kind of programs will just have to be really strategic about addressing some of the tricky aspects of having a tutoring program outside the school day. Specifically, as I mentioned, attendance can be a real challenge, particularly for older students when their parents don't rely on it for childcare. And attendance is really key for students to reap the benefits of tutoring and to develop those relationships we hope they'll develop with tutors. And then the other thing is just the challenge of aligning with the curriculum and experience that students are having during the school day. Those are not insurmountable challenges by any means, but in order for an after-school program to be successful, those are things that the providers will have to think about.
Casey or John Paul, anything to weigh in on that one? If not, we've got lots of questions, so I'll keep going. There was a couple of questions that popped out at me as something we haven't touched on. One was, what about how do you exit a relationship for a tutor and a student? It was specifically in reference to using college students as tutors. And the person who posted it in chat had some concern about, perhaps college students not being as available, or their schedules might, they might run into problem with scheduling, et cetera. So, but how do you end up exiting a relationship in a way that is thoughtful for both the student and the tutor? John Paul, have you had much, have you been able to deal with that problem yet?
Yeah, so I mean, the main thing that we do is we set expectations up front that if you're interested in tutoring with the school districts that North Carolina Education Corps partners with, you're going to commit to the full year to do it. So we really believe that in consistent relationships, that's critically important. Now with college students, I think that we see this sometimes where a student has been able to commit for a semester. That's a pretty decent amount of time. It's not, what we want to avoid is sort of these flash in the pan type relationships between tutors and students. But we set expectations up front that if you're interested in high impact tutoring, what the research shows and what our experience shows is the best way to do that and to drive results is to build strong relationships with the students. And so we require that tutors make a longer term commitment than just showing up for a Saturday.
Anyone else want to say anything about that? So there were a couple of questions about target population and a specific question about training tutors for children who have dyslexia. Anything specific about training tutors for children with special learning needs or special needs in general, or anything that you might want to speak to about that, or any other special populations or target populations that you have taken into consideration?
I can jump in here. Again, from a high level, I'm not actually in the practice at this moment, but in past experiences, dyslexia or other learning disabilities, tutors can certainly make an impact there. More often than not, though, those students who have characteristics of dyslexia or a true diagnosis of dyslexia, they actually do need someone who has intensive training in multisensory instruction and in areas along with phonemic awareness, phonics, so that they can get very consistent, intensive support throughout the school year. And a lot of schools have had programs to support those students for a long period of time. It varies certainly by district, because with local control, that is a district decision. As far as the high dosage tutoring that we're talking about today, I can't speak to an example where I know that that has been a focus of high dosage tutoring programs that have resulted in the last couple of years, but I know there have been efforts in place for many years for many of those students. But in this realm, there's certainly an opportunity, but I think that the way that they're going to identify students for most of the tutoring programs is going to be based on data and who has the need recognized through maybe a universal screener where they've looked at broad early literacy skills, and particularly as today we're talking about like K-3 models. They would administer a universal screener at the beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year in most states, and be able to identify who those students are, and then be able to tailor supports to them. And high dosage tutoring initiatives actually just extend what has already also been a recommended practice with MTSS models, multi-tiered systems of support, and RTI, response to intervention. So high dosage tutoring initiatives can be a way to advance those elements that have been in place for a number of years. We just find ourselves in a place now where more than ever we have a large number of students who need that supplemental instruction to fill the gaps that they had not maybe previously experienced but now do.
I'll just add that our thank you so much for that, Casey, and really wholeheartedly agree. And we'll just reference our partners at the National Center for Learning Disabilities have put out some resources on tutoring and how it can meet the needs of students with disabilities and the broader population of students with learning differences, including students with dyslexia. And so would just encourage folks to check out their resources.
Thank you. There were a number of questions and comments about how tutoring programs, school-based tutoring programs might connect with nonprofit partners in the community, and how to make this a broader community conversation and set of supports for kids and families. And have you seen models, one where perhaps some of this funding has gone to nonprofits? John Paul, you are a nonprofit, started a 501c3, but are there other, do you have experiences with how other nonprofits have been engaged with this, or how other districts have worked with nonprofits? Anything that you could speak to how the community writ large has been engaged in these models beyond recruiting tutors, that kind of thing. So anything that you might speak to that would be great as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, I think there's a lot of interest in the community to support teachers and students, and it's really hard to engage in a story when the plot isn't clear. So we have to make it really clear to people where they can get involved to support students within public school districts. And I think what we try to do is we try to create a clear pathway for them to be able to do that. I also think that there's a lot of opportunity for school districts to work with strong organizations that have been out there for a long time, like YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs, to figure out how do we recruit more people within the broader community to serve as high impact tutors or high dosage tutors with kids. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think it just takes a little bit of time and intentionality for those nonprofit partners and public, school districts to get together to explore how best to go about that. Like I said, a lot of opportunity there. I think there's also, what's really great about what Allison and Casey are doing that we've benefited from is there's a lot of research out there that shows you, okay, here are the parameters of what you need to do to have a successful evidence-based high dosage tutoring program, which allow you to inform how you're recruiting, how you're training, how you're supporting kids, and that allow you to kind of leapfrog a lot of mistakes that you might make if you're building from scratch. So, what I'm really excited about is the possibility of engaging more community members to be involved in schools on an ongoing basis. I think that serving as a high impact tutor is a great entry point. And I think we're getting better and better at figuring out how to provide differentiated training to high dosage tutors so that they can support students in an appropriate way. And if, I think back, I was a history major as an undergrad. When Henry Ford first built the Model T, it took him 13 hours to put it together. 5 years later, it took him 90 seconds. So I think we're in this process of figuring out how do we build the systems to really engage more community members to support teachers and students in an evidence-based, data-driven way.
This is Barbara again. I'm curious about the role of training tutors in how to respond to or manage behavioral health issues with the students?
Really good question.
So I think that's a critical part of the early, and we do some of that training with our tutors. We really believe in it. One of our board members is the superintendent of Chatham County Schools in North Carolina, and he says, relationships lead to results. So we have a strong belief that you need to build strong relationships with students before you can even get to the academic part of the work that tutors are doing. And you have to consider those behavioral issues that students may have that may affect what that relationship looks like. I think in some ways this is related to the question about can high-dosage tutors be good support for students with dyslexia? I think part of what high-dosage tutors do is they free up teachers to be able to spend more time with the students with more intensive needs. And that's kind of, that's a positive effect of what high-dosage tutors bring to the classroom. So if there are students with significant behavioral issues, in many cases, they're probably not the right students to match the tutors with. But if the tutors are there in the classroom working with other students, it frees up the teacher's time to spend more time with the kids who have behavioral issues or more intensive needs.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that in addition to the importance of providing training and support to tutors to handle, what we traditionally call it classroom management or managing challenging behaviors. In addition to that, and then obviously the training to execute the academic aspect of tutoring, one of the things we've really been pushing folks to think about, just like we would for educators, is to provide support for tutors to engage in anti-bias training. And given the impact of the pandemic, particularly on students of color, we really want to make sure that the tutors that are engaging with students have high expectations, are approaching students with an asset-based lens, and are really engaging with students in ways that will build their confidence and build their sense of self. And that's often something I think that goes untalked about for classroom teachers as well as tutors. This is a relatively new and growing area. And I really am hopeful that as we continue to track promising practices at the state and district level, that we'll begin to see examples of that happening, because it's going to be really important for that relationship building.
I think that's a really important point, Allison. Training around diversity, anti-bias, inclusiveness practices, and then it will always go back to the relationship that the tutor is able to build with the student. And so that is, there's so much around the opportunity, whether it be a teacher or a tutor, when we build and establish strong relationships with our students and we elevate their strengths and help them feel successful, they desire more of that. And so it certainly extends the opportunity to continue to be a support to them.
Thanks.
There was a question about both digital training and offering digital tutoring. Have you seen this method be successful in a high dosage tutoring environment? Can this happen and be successful if it's delivered digitally or virtually?
So I can speak for a moment from both personal experience and the research, which is, I think I mentioned at the top of our time together that I worked as an instructional coach for kindergarten and first grade teachers in rural North Carolina. North Carolina really representing today. I'm feeling very proud. And that's professional development and support that I provided those teachers was almost exclusively virtual. And it was a way to provide teachers in more geographically isolated rural districts in North Carolina with connections to someone who could provide and sustain professional development for them. And that program, targeted reading intervention, is now among the tutoring programs, the early literacy tutoring programs with a really strong evidence-based got the What Works Clearinghouse seal. It's in the proventutoring.org website that I think Jen was chatting about. And that's just one example, but I think it is a good question. And I think it is worth asking how we can leverage technology to provide training to more educators and to school and district leaders in order to expand the reach of targeted intensive tutoring.
So we're coming to the end of our time, and Sarah, oh, there's the survey. Please fill it out. It helps us with our accountability too. And I'm now going to ask, we'll thank the panelists for just a terrific conversation and such an integrated view of nationwide and specific down to districts. I really appreciate it. Thank you for that. And we are going to encourage you to fill out the survey poll on this and ask Becky to close us out.
Sure. And I just want to as well say, big thank you to each of our panelists. I think we had such even though it was North Carolina heavy, we did have such a wide range of the research. We got to look at the detail about different states, both from Casey's piece that she did with ExcelinEd and from Allison's research. And then we really did get to look at the nuts and bolts of what it's like to start this from the ground up with John Paul. So thank you so much. Yes, you're getting your kudos in the chat box. And we had lots of links posted. Those will all go out to everyone. Big apologies for the links to the slides and the bios not working. We will figure out on our end what's happening with that, but they will all come out in a post to you following this. Later this week, early next week at the very latest, but probably yet late this week, as well as the recording. So you'll have all of this information. So thank you all for spending 90 minutes of your precious Tuesday with us. So we're super happy. Want to remind you that we have some upcoming webinars. I posted registration links to those early in the chat. And we would love to have you join us for our upcoming webinars. Keep your Tuesdays open, as we like to say, and come along and join us as we continue GLR Learning Tuesdays. And the 18th through the 22nd is grade level reading week. So we have a webinar every single day in July. So we'll look forward to having you join us for some of those as well. And with that, I'll just say, final thank you to our panelists, and Barbara, thank you so much for joining us and moderating, and we'll say goodbye to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Are you signing off, Becky, or can I just thank you and Sarah again for being so terrific about showing me how to do this?
Sure. Yeah, I think people are still on. Hang on. We still have participants.
Casey, can you close us out?
Yep.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful webinar.